Welcome, everyone. My name is Jason Hogstad, and today I will be giving a talk based on an article that appeared in the spring 2020 edition of the Louisville Historian on the role animals have played in Louisville's history. This talk will expand on those ideas. You can find the full article on the museum's website. Now, before we dive into the talk and to illustrate the main point we'll be wrestling with, I ask that you do me a favor. I'd like you to think of the last time you saw an animal in Louisville. Where were you? What was it doing? Take a minute to really recall as much as you can about this recent animal encounter. Now, because you're listening to this talk remotely and to illustrate just how varied the experiences might be that you are imagining, consider all the different animals you could be thinking of. Take a stroll on Davidson Mesa and you might see enthusiastic dogs, goats munching, or even prairie dogs grazing. Walk along Cold Creek Trail and you might encounter a solitary coyote, a gaggle of geese, or even horses in the early morning. And it's not just open space that is full of animals. Step outside your home and you might see rabbits, squirrels, or even nesting baby owls. These photographs were all taken in Louisville over the last few years. Now think of how you felt when you had this most recent animal encounter. Was it wonder at seeing something that felt wild? Maybe indifference at witnessing something that you have seen so often before that the animal barely even registered as anything more than part of the landscape? Or perhaps you felt frustration or fear at finding an animal in a place you did not expect or wanted. Say finding proof there was a mouse in your house. Excitement, wonder, surprise, frustration, or indifference are just a few of the emotions people experience when encountering animals. In many ways, our range of emotions can be as varied as the kinds of animals we run into themselves. Now, you may be wondering why I asked you to think of how you felt about the last animal you ran into. It doesn't seem like a very historical question. But the point of the exercise is this. I wanted to take a moment to establish that animals are a part of everyday life in Louisville. We encounter an incredible variety of animals in the city, and their presence is part of what makes Louisville, Louisville. We have dogs at the farmers market, prairie dogs on the mesa, and burros and cows in agricultural open spaces. As these examples suggest, most of the time we have a general idea of where an animal belongs. Our reaction to an animal is, in part, related to whether or not it is where we think it should be when we find it. People's ideas about what animals belong where have not been the same through time, however. They change over the course of history as our relationship with the animals themselves changes. Take a look at this picture, taken at the corner of Pine and Main in the early 20th century. No one today would expect to walk downtown and see three horses with wagons blocking the street. But Louisville residents living over a century ago would not have batted an eye. Today, we don't have the same relationship with horses that Louisville residents once had, and as such, we don't expect horses to be in the same places that people once did. But our ideas about where animals belong have also changed because people in the past have altered where certain animals can be or live. By doing so, residents transformed life in Louisville and the feel of the town. Looking at how people have attempted to regulate, remove, or control animals, and let's be honest, trying to do so is sometimes as effective as metaphorical cat herding. But looking at those things can help us get a better sense for what past Louisville residents wanted the town to be. Studying animals can reveal people's priorities. In changing what animals belonged where, Louisville residents were changing what kind of town they lived in. Now, some of the earliest examples we have of Louisville regulating animals comes from the late 1800s. In 1882, Louisville was a new town. It wasn't even 5 years old yet. And as a young mining community, it was a bit of a rough and tumble place. To many, unregulated animals were a part of the problem. An article from the Boulder County Herald decried the unsanitary conditions of the town at that time, charging that dead pigs and cats and dogs lined the streets. At the time, animals still roamed most American streets at will. Few were owned in any sense that we would recognize, although some were tolerated for various reasons. New York City actually had roving bands of semi-feral hogs that served as an informal trash collection service in the 19th century. But as the Herald's article reminded readers, when unowned and uncontrolled animals passed away, no one was responsible for cleaning up their bodies. And so, rotting animal corpses, combined with other trash, littered Louisville's streets in its early years. Even before they died, however, these animals could damage property, prompting city officials and residents to rethink where they would allow certain animals to be. In 1894, the city prohibited residents from letting a cow run loose between 8 p.m. and 5 a.m., declaring that if a cow was found at large at midnight or at night, the marshal could impound it, charge its owner with a misdemeanor, and collect a fine ranging from $1 to $5. Pigs seem to have been a more serious problem, or at least the town was more serious about making sure no uncontrolled pigs were on the streets. An 1895 ordinance set the fine for allowing swine to run at large within the town limits as high as $25 for each offense. At the same time as it was regulating the presence of cattle and pigs, Louisville also changed how dogs could live within town limits. Starting in 1895, all dogs had to be collared and licensed, and any unowned dog, especially those deemed vicious, could be impounded or killed by the marshal. In another 1895 ordinance, the town also empowered the marshal with the ability to declare any unowned animal a nuisance and remove it from the streets. And so, within a set of 3 years, Louisville completely remade itself, removing roving bands of dogs, cattle, and pigs from its streets. Now, these laws were a part of a larger public health initiative aimed at making Louisville a cleaner, healthier place. And they occurred at a time when most American cities and towns were passing similar regulations. But they also prove our larger point. Altering where animals can be changes what a place is like. Looking through Louisville's earliest ordinances reveals a haphazard, but ultimately successful attempt to remake the town's landscape by controlling how and when cattle, pigs, and dogs could move through Louisville's streets. But the ordinances also remind us that the city was not simply removing all large animals from public thoroughfares. Rather, it was choosing which animal species could leave and which ones could stay. The town was in the process of selecting which animals belonged where. Take a look at this picture. You'll notice that there are no roving bands of pigs devouring trash lining the streets, no semi-feral packs of dogs prowling the alleyways, and no cows meandering down the road. And yet, there are signs that another animal is quite welcomed here. Lining both sides of Main Street are numerous hitching posts. Remember, this was a time when horses were the primary form of transportation. If you wanted to get to a place the train didn't go, you had two options: start walking or use a horse. Louisville had entire businesses devoted to horse travel. Several livery stables like this business, operated by James Connors on Front Street, would either board your horse or rent you one if you needed it. In fact, at the same time that Louisville was limiting the presence of dogs, pigs, and cattle on its streets, it was trying to regulate its streets to make way for more horses. And what is probably the city's first parking regulation, an 1895 ordinance limited the amount of time you could keep your horse hitched to a hitching post to 3 hours downtown. Now, today when we look back at these early ordinances to change where certain animals belong, we might see this process as inevitable. It makes sense. We might tell ourselves that farm animals belong in a farm, that dogs belong in a yard, and that we shouldn't have bands of pigs eating trash downtown. But the point of this talk is that our sense that a cow or pig is out of place downtown is a product of history. People's actions in the past bounding certain animals to certain locations influence our assumptions about where those animals belong today. Take mules and coal mines, for example. The many coal mines in operation around Louisville used mules to move literal tons of coal from deep below the earth to the elevators running to the surface every day. When we share about Louisville's coal mining history with visitors at the museum, we normally get one of two initial reactions after telling folks that that mules were critical to coal mines' success in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Those visitors who are aware of mules' roles in mines normally nod or maybe ask to learn a little bit more about a fact they already knew. They might ask about what mules' lives were like, how much they could pull, or whether or not the mules lived underground. But visitors who never knew that mules were central to coal extraction are typically surprised, if not stupefied. The reaction, like an assumption that pigs shouldn't run loose on the street, is a product of history and the ways we imagine certain places to be. We typically think of coal mines as industrial spaces. And in the minds of modern Americans, industrial spaces are filled with clanking machinery, not sweating animals. Just like the astonishment we might react with if we saw a cow on Main Street in Louisville today, confusion about mules and mines reminds us that we read current assumptions about where animals belong back into the past. And then we are surprised when we find out things weren't quite like we might have thought. Now, Louisville's early ordinances might have removed some animals from the streets, but they didn't necessarily establish pigs or cattle as purely farm animals. Although large animals continue to do farm work here as well, as this image of the Harney farm from the 1920s reminds us. Rather, people in town who most decidedly did not live on what we would consider a farm continued to raise animals for sustenance. As this image of a backyard in Louisville's Little Italy shows. In part, the presence of cows, pigs, rabbits, and chickens in residents' backyards was a result of local need. The seasonality of coal work and the boom and bust nature of its industry often meant that Louisville families had to be frugal with their finances. Raising animals in their backyards let them do so. Now, make no mistake, backyard chickens were not the novelty they are today. But raising animals for food was also fairly common outside of Louisville. The historical process that moved large agricultural animals from within a municipality and cemented them firmly as farm animals took longer in America than we might think, even if that process played out more slowly still in Louisville and other economically depressed locations. But as the 20th century progressed and Louisville's coal mines died, the habit of raising animals for food waned. Over time, cows, horses, and pigs would transition from backyard animals to creatures increasingly only found on the farms or in the city. The ordinances also changed the ways the city interacts with dogs and their expectations about where one can find them. Combing the museum's historic photograph collection reveals picture after picture of pet dogs. People pose with them in photography studios and outside. They feature dogs prominently in images in which they're the only subject. And as this photograph shows, they make sure to include them in a picture taken outside one's favorite saloon. You can see a dog in someone's arms on the left. Now, the dogs in these images are not the wandering, unowned, semi-feral canines that worried the city in the 1890s. No, these animals, like more and more dogs across the country as the 20th century wore on, were a part of the family. At the same time that Louisville was moving large animals to its agricultural outskirts, it found itself enmeshed in another removal process concerning two very different species of animals whose relationship with our area was both more complicated and controversial. Take a moment to look at these two specimens. What words pop into your mind to describe them? Let's start with the prairie dog. Most people in Louisville are familiar with this animal. You can see them on the side of the highway, in open spaces, or sometimes even empty lots. You may have heard them chirp at you as you wandered too close to their tunnels, seen them scamper about as they graze on foliage, or even watched them groom one another in a manner that looks surprisingly like kissing. Looking at these images now, you might have any number of reactions. To some, prairie dogs are cute mammals whose antics provide entertainment. Others might not respond to their appearance, but rather see in these images an animal that performs a critical ecological role throughout the West. Prairie dogs are keystone species whose burrows provide habitat to a number of other animals. Still, other people looking at this image might have a different reaction altogether. To many, prairie dogs represent a threat to agricultural production or an impediment to real estate development. While people might react to a prairie dog differently than these three responses, the variety we've discussed does make it clear that a single animal can inspire conflicting and mutually exclusive feelings. And these different reactions often lead one to different ideas about what our contemporary relationship with prairie dogs should be and where we think these animals should live. The same applies to coyotes. Although there has never been a full consensus about what to do with coyotes or prairie dogs in our part of Colorado, looking at the ways these animals were treated historically can help us understand another aspect of Louisville's environmental history. At the same time that Louisville and other American towns were moving large animals out of the streets and onto surrounding farms, the agricultural land that horses, pigs, and cows were being relegated to was being stripped of coyotes and prairie dogs. For coyotes, the process in much of the US West, including Colorado and even Boulder County, went something like this. In the 1890s, after a couple of decades of citizen-led coyote eradication programs, state officials implemented a bounty program, paying a premium for each coyote pelt a person turned in. While these programs were fairly successful in reducing the regional coyote population, they were also controversial, although the controversy was not over the actual killing. Opponents of a statewide bounty program worried that participation in the program would be so high that it might bankrupt the state. In the 1890s, Colorado papers opposed to bounties loved to tout California as an example. The Sunshine State had apparently gotten itself into financial trouble when its residents turned in more coyote pelts than it was prepared to pay for. Coloradan bounty opponents were not wrong, it turns out. In 1895, state residents turned in so many pelts that they exhausted the annual bounty budget. Paying for pelts was not the only way that Coloradans reduced the number of coyotes in our part of the state. In the late 19th and early 20th century, Coloradans, like other Westerners, would meet at predetermined locations to dash through the landscape, hoping to scare and then slaughter whatever animals they were seeking to remove from the local area. In Boulder County, coyotes were sometimes a target of these communal scenes of slaughter. Although throughout the 1890s, the residents of Boulder, Longmont, Hygiene, Lafayette, and perhaps Louisville organized coyote hunts with their neighbors. Although these hunts were never as successful at killing a large number of coyotes as bounty programs were, they do reveal a zeal for extermination that trapping for bounties never matched. Bounty programs, communal hunts, and county-employed hunters continued to reduce the number of coyotes across the West and in our part of the state during the 20th century, paving the way for a transformation of the unsettled lands in our part of Colorado into agricultural spaces. Now, we don't know if Louisville residents ever supported or participated in coyote eradication strategies like these. We're lacking those sources. And there's good reason to think that town residents might not have been as enthusiastic to remove coyotes from the landscape as residents of Boulder, Longmont, and Hygiene. Mining towns typically did not target coyotes or other predators with as much ire as communities comprised mostly of farmers did. Regardless of Louisville's level of participation, however, it is hard to deny that the region as a whole was unaffected by the ways these eliminatory strategies remapped the Front Range's agricultural spaces. The history of where Louisville and its surrounding towns have wanted prairie dogs is even more complicated than its relationship with coyotes. Take another look at this animal. As I mentioned before, although there are some who might still view prairie dogs as pests, many do not. That was not the case in Boulder County 120 years ago. In the early 19th century, many Coloradans viewed prairie dogs and agricultural production as mutually exclusive. Their viewpoint was shared by scientists working at the county, state, and federal level. These scientists brought a modern approach to pest control and worked alongside regional farmers to determine the best way to poison prairie dogs in order to remove these animals from competing with agricultural pursuits. Louisville was in the middle of this larger statewide effort to remove these animals from the local landscape. Between 1921 and 1923, scientists working for the Colorado Extension Service and Boulder County residents poisoned prairie dogs on over 8,000 acres of agricultural land. Their efforts had such an effect that farmers dramatically cut back the amount of poisoning they did in the remainder of the decade, citing decreased prairie dog numbers as the reason. Poisoning efforts like these continued for the next several decades, although their intensity rose and fell to match the local prairie dog population. By 1960, Westerners had reduced the prairie dog population to less than 5% of its estimated 19th century numbers. The ongoing removal of coyotes and prairie dogs from the landscape that paved the way for agricultural production in places like Boulder County was a part of the larger process that altered the way we think about what animals belong where. At the same time that towns like Louisville were removing cows and pigs from their streets and sending them to surrounding farms, farmers, ranchers, and scientists were doing their best to remove wild animals like coyotes and prairie dogs so that agricultural production could continue to expand. This process resulted in remapping of the landscape in people's minds that lingers today. We coded certain places as the domain of certain species. Dogs are okay in the city, pigs are not. Cows can be on a farm, but a farm shouldn't be home to prairie dogs. We're happy to let coyotes roam in whatever spaces we deem wild, but tend to be worried when we see a dog without an owner in those same wild places. Now, this is a gross generalization. Life and history are messier than our imagined ideas about where animals should or should not be. And as anyone who has ever seen a coyote in downtown Louisville can attest, animals have their own agency and don't tend to stay where we think they belong. But that doesn't mean that this larger process hasn't influenced our ideas about where animals do belong. Louisville's history with animals has become even more complicated in the last several decades. A commitment to and love of open space, coupled with a dramatic increase in residential and commercial development, has meant that developers, not farmers or ranchers, are now competing with wild animals like prairie dogs. Large-scale infrastructure projects and the development of a local tech industry dramatically altered the city. These changes eventually led to debates about how to grow in the 1970s and 1980s, and in the midst of these conversations, tensions rose over what to do with prairie dog colonies located on sites marked for construction. Discussions about where a single animal could or could not live revealed a larger debate about what type of place Louisville should be. At its core, the decision to relegate certain animals to certain locations is about deciding what a place will be like. Louisville's changing relationship with animals can tell us a lot about who we have been as a city, what we have valued, and what life has been like for those who have lived here. Over the course of our history, our collective assumptions about where certain animals belong have changed dramatically. Pigs no longer amble along our alleyways, and coyotes are no longer shot on sight. But rather than seeing our collective relationship with animals as the sign of progress, it's better to realize that at any given point in our history, Louisville's relationship with animals reflected the priorities and collective identity of our town at that time. It's easy to feel that Louisville has changed dramatically in the last few decades, and it's impossible to deny that it has. But by looking at the more gradual shift in how Louisville has thought about a few animal species, we can recognize an important truth about our town. Louisville has always been changing. Each generation here has had to decide who we are and who we will be. Thank you.